Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, once again we're here in beautiful Melbourne town, and once again we're on the grounds of the University of Melbourne where I toiled for many years. And once again I'm really pleased to be joined by somebody who I had knew when I was at the University of Melbourne and who I've had the privilege of engaging with intellectually via the Knowing Animals reading group that meets monthly at the University of Melbourne. So this episode we're joined by Dr. Hayley Singer from the University of Melbourne. Hayley has a PhD in creative writing and is interested in ecological and feminist theories of flesh, fiction, avant-garde writing practice and philosophy. Today we're going to consider her piece. Now, this one, as with the last episode, if you listen to it with Sue, I also can't pronounce the title. So we've got a new theme. It used to be that I could never get people's names right. Now I can't get the titles of the journal articles right. So why don't I bring Hayley into the conversation and she can tell us what her journal article is called. Welcome to Knowing Animals, Hayley Singer.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. It's really great to be here.
Thank you for being here. So your article appeared in Animal Studies in 2016.
It did, and it's called Writing the Fleischgeist.
Writing the Fleischgeist. Okay. So I'm going to vaguely forgive myself from not being confident with that word.
That's fine.
Even though if I went away and got better, we wouldn't have these problems. So Hayley, can you start by telling us what led you to write this work?
Yeah, I think it really started in 2011 when I was starting to read a boutique culinary culture journal called Meat Paper. And in that paper, in the first edition, the editors suggested that what they were really tracing in their journal was something called the Fleischgeist, and they defined that as the culinary zeitgeist. And they really did that, and I thought it was interesting. Their articles in that journal looked at things like rockstar butchers, nose to tail eating, meat glue, and Lady Gaga's meat dress. So it was a really interesting way in which they were re-articulating the world or reframing the world really as a fleshscape. And that just both troubled me and captured my imagination. But most of all, the term Fleischgeist really intrigued me. I felt like this word was full of potential, and still I'm finding ways that this word means so many different things. So I think that the word really needs to be unpacked, and that's a lot of the work that I'm still doing now. I've done that a little bit in the article, but something that needs to be said about the word is that one of the most important things for me is that it's a pun. It's a pun on Hegel's term Zeitgeist. It's a German compound word that uses both Fleisch, which means flesh, meat or muscle, and Geist, meaning ghost or spirit of an individual or a group. It can also speak to the idea of a consciousness or a set of beliefs that are alive at a certain point in time. Put those two terms together and you've got this idea that in the contemporary moment there's really like a meat consciousness or sort of like a frenzied spirit in the air where people are so focused on meat as a product, as a consumable. So I'm interested in that meaning of it, but I'm also mostly interested in really teasing out the meanings of the term Fleischgeist as a way of understanding it to describe kind of a cultural haunting, where I think that people are haunted or ghosted by a deep philosophical disturbance of what goes on in factory farms and how meat gets onto their plate, how dairy gets into their fridge, and etc. So I'm really interested in thinking about how novelists, in particular novelists from the 1990s through to through to now, are writing this condition of cultural haunting. So, and that's what I start to do in this article, in particular with Deborah Levy's brilliant work of experimental poetics called Diary of a Steak. I absolutely love that book. I think I would love to walk into a room and be able to have a conversation with people about this book. I think it's so fabulous. It's been chronically put out of circulation. This is something that's very interesting to me. Deborah Levy is still alive. She's still publishing, and most of her works a lot of her works are actually out of publication. They're not being reprinted. They're very political. They're very interesting as well. That hardly needs to be said. But in particular, Diary of a Steak really captured my imagination in terms of this idea of the Fleischgeist and the cultural haunting of sort of what goes on in factory farms.
So, Hayley, one of my first questions that I was wanting to ask you was what Diary of a Steak is all about. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Absolutely. So, Diary of a Steak, it's a really short poetic work. It brings together voices from sort of the 19th century British and French asylums, and in particular, it brings the voices of sort of Freud and other really famous sort of psychologists and psychoanalysis into the mix, and it sort of enjams them with this imagined voice of Buttercup, who is a steak carved off a 30-month-old calf infected with BSE, or sort of mad cow disease. And what is really interesting is that as Levy juxtaposes these two voices, they're both very real voices, but the voice of the steak is obviously imagined, but it draws very heavily on a lot of the journalism, a lot of the political rhetoric that was going on in the 90s around the outbreak or the British BSE crisis. What's interesting to me, because I'm into both feminism and animal studies, is that it really merges these two fields and shows a really disturbing resonance between what was going on in sort of 19th century asylums, what was being done to women, how they were being codified as mad and animalistic, and you know, in a way, the ways that the media was really codifying these cows that were, you know, experiencing the horrific degenerative disease, the neurological disease of BSE. So I think that this book uses some really interesting sort of avant-garde narrative tactics and techniques, such as collage, narrative collage, bringing fragments of text together and not explaining anything for the reader. I had the experience this semester of setting Diary of a Steak for students who have no background in animal studies or necessarily feminism, and just experiencing their range of responses to it. Some students were absolutely disgusted and appalled. Some students found it absolutely hilarious. Others were completely lost. But whatever was the actual response to it, everybody was deeply engaged with this question of, why are these voices being brought together? And I think that's extremely generative, and that's part of why I think that creative writing, or, you know, both fiction and non-fiction, is a really powerful tool, particularly in terms of animal studies and talking about the lives of animals.
So, in your mind, is feminism and animal studies, are they natural bedfellows? Should they be together?
I do think so. And I think the way that all modes of oppression need to be considered alongside each other as having important resonances and important differences. I know that this will sort of connect up with a question that you're going to ask me later, but, you know, really my thinking has in so many ways been catalysed by Carol Adams' The Sexual Politics of Meat. And I remember the day that I started reading that book, I just felt like a fire was lit in my brain, and my heart and my guts. And it was like I couldn't sit down for days. I was filled with so much energy that she had actually just articulated something that was in the air. It's palpable. And I still walk around collecting photographs of moments in sort of mainstream, or, you know, just posters or images or on menus where I see the denigration of women and animals happening at the same time. So, for example, a pub near my house on Australia Day this year had this sort of really classic image of a 1950s sort of pin-up standing there holding a hunk of steak, saying, you know, like, Australia Day barbecue, you know, come and get it. It is shocking to me still, but it's also not surprising that those images are still being circulated uncritically. But that stands as proof to me that this work still needs to continue, and there's still a lot of a lot of work to be done. But I do think that talking about all modes of oppression alongside one another is very important.
So in your article, you seek to amend or update or challenge Carol Adams on one particular point to do with collage. Can you explain to listeners what that is and what contribution you're seeking to make?
So the idea of narrative collage is working both with fragmentation of text and then bringing two juxtaposing pieces of text together. So these can be from found sources, or they can be something that the writer has written sort of for themselves, and they're bringing together in a disparate way, or a way that sort of clangs as opposed to stands in harmony and makes sort of a clean or smoothless meaning. So in collage, it's really important that you've got this sort of tension between two pieces of text that come together, and it sort of troubles the reader. I think that sort of mode of troubling is very important, and I also think it connects with the idea of haunting. So that's very interesting to me. But the point that I really pick up on is that fragmentation is extremely important in being able to produce a narrative collage. And so I was talking to somebody about this a few weeks ago, and they were suggesting that Carol Adams is not against fragmentation in a creative work. And I think that is an absolutely fair. That is an absolutely fair reading. But the point that I think that I'm trying to make in relation to Adams's work, and I do make the statement, I'm not trying to take away from her work at all. I'm trying to add something to that, which is that fragmentation, particularly when you start merging feminist and animal studies together, fragmentation is extremely important in terms of the lineage of feminist creative writing practices. So I think that it needs to be talked about more, fragmentation, and what it can actually do in terms of illuminating without trying to resolve any of the difficulties that sort of exist in between women and animals and the way that women and other animals are treated. So that's sort of what I was trying to do in that part of the essay or the article.
So, Hayley, you write that humans tend to be transfixed by cruelty, but also that the types of cruelties I guess we normally consider or are transfixed by are only, a tiny proportion of the suffering that is going on, much of which is occurring in slaughterhouses. Can you talk us through that idea and the role of cruelty in your article?
Yeah, I think that cruelty is very interesting. Cruelty, particularly in art, is a very interesting phenomenon as well. It's something that people are drawn to, and I'm drawn to it in particular because I think it's a very interesting thing to think about. But I sort of think about cruelty in terms of the abject and obscenities. Cruelty is something that is supposed to be put off the cultural scene. It's supposed to be segregated or sequestered. But the abject, as Julia Kristeva writes in Powers of Horror, is something that we are also perversely drawn to. So there's a way in which cruelty is something that we're both drawn to, but we want to push away from ourselves as well. I think that the connection between cruelty and art and, for example, the cruelty that goes on in slaughterhouses is that, in a way, we ingest them both. There's this really brilliant book of cultural critique that I absolutely love by Maggie Nelson called The Art of Cruelty, and that work is very important for me. And in one moment of that book, she talks about the experience of reading or taking in artwork that is about cruelty and feeling as if you've eaten something poisonous. I found that to be extremely interesting because that resonates with what Elizabeth Costello says in the novel by Coetzee. She talks about feeling like she's taken in this evil after she read that book on the July plotters by Paul West. It's sort of later in the novel, I think it's maybe lesson 6. But she talks about feeling that she's got this poison running through her and that she's actually quite haunted by that, really troubled by that. And I'm sort of just at the moment really working to think this through, literally ingesting the product of cruelty through eating meat and other kinds of animal products, but also in how we connect with art, how we interface with art. It's another kind of ingestation, if that is a word. I don't know, I just made it up. It's another way to take in cruelty. And I think that we're doing a lot. We are taking in a lot of cruelty, and often that's just being done without it being acknowledged. And I think it needs to be acknowledged first. We need to really look at all of the various ways that we're taking it in and think about it strategically. Which ones can help us to resolve these sort of structural problems that make sure that cruelty is perpetuated, and which are the ones that are just perpetuating cruelty. I think it's a very interesting thing to think about.
Fabulous. Now, Hayley, I ask everyone who comes on the program to answer 5 quick questions. And normally at this point, I'd say, are you ready for your 5 quick questions? But I realised that I forgot to mention our sponsors. So I'm just going to have a little ad break here before we go into the 5 quick questions. So I should say that this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, when this podcast is coming out, it'll probably be the very start of the ASA conference that's being held at the University of Adelaide. Now, if it's possible that some people will hear this and immediately be inspired and race to the University of Adelaide to join the conference, but it's also more likely that many people will have missed it. So if you did miss a conference, that means that you're not a member of ASA, you're not getting their regular updates, their newsletters, and it also means that you're not following them on Facebook and Twitter. So you should rectify that straight away. Join ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. It's working very hard on behalf of animal studies scholars, but it needs your support. Membership is just $50, 50 Australian dollars. Okay, Hayley, are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I'm going to say Carol Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat, particularly because that was the one that absolutely it was a fire. Yeah.
Right. Can you remember the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I think it was my PhD. I mean, and all the little bits that led up to that, but I think it was my PhD. And then probably this article that has come out of that would be the one that I would say is really like the first.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Lovely. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Many, and I know that most people who come on this show say more than one, so I am going to stick to one. I'm going to try really hard to do that. And risking being repetitive and boring, I still want to say Carol Adams. I come back to her, I don't think that a week goes by where I don't sort of just come back to something that she's written, whether it's through trying to, looking back through her books or her articles or her interviews, or just finding that something that she has said is totally relevant to the conversation that I'm in and needs to be said and she needs to be referenced. This is something that I feel so deeply about, like that people don't just think that these ideas are circulating through the stratosphere without being anchored in both a body of work and also a feminist, lineage. Like we have it there and it's a strong, like I feel so lucky to inherit this work that I just,
Okay. Wonderful. What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Yeah, I really want to reinforce, I know some people have said, teaching this material, and I really do think that we need, obviously, just to reinforce what Barbara Creed said, which does not need reinforcement, I know that, but we need to be teaching it here, like in a really sort of legitimised way. Like we need to have courses that students can sign up to. We have the Knowing Animals reading group. I've actually just this year started an eco-feminist reading group here at the uni, but we need to have like real courses that people can sign up to and graduate from and go out into the world and say, I've got a degree in animal studies. This needs to be done. But in the meantime, I do think, and I think that this came out of a conversation that you and I had, Siobhan, maybe last year or earlier this year, where in the meantime, we just need to be teaching this stuff. We just need to get, both feminist animal studies information through to our students in whatever way we can. And I did just have an experience this semester of being able to do that, setting contemporary fictions like Mari Dariusek's Pigtails, Kerridge Windovi's Only the Animals, Kotzia's The Lives of Animals, Han Kang's A Vegetarian. And the conversations that we had in those rooms were explosive, like in a really positive way, because people were talking about issues regarding human-animal suffering, but their defenses were sort of down because we were also there to talk about creative writing, narrative tactics and techniques. So some of those usual defenses that might come up if we were sitting at a dinner table and you were the only vegan at the table, you know, all of that sort of stuff that might otherwise come up, that sort of dissolved. And we're actually able to get to some really important points, you know, regarding how do we write this stuff? How do we think about this stuff creatively? And because creative writing, I think, is at bottom, you know, like it has to be an act of empathy. You have to really try to empathize with the characters you are writing. So in a way, bringing this information into a creative writing class that is about how do we think empathetically about others, it just really changed the dynamic for me. And it was really interesting. Yeah, but I think bringing it into the classrooms now.
Yeah. Fabulous. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
This is so hard. And yeah, I've been thinking about this morning. I want people to recognize when they are being cruel, like just as a first thing. This is something that really bothers me. I live in an area of Melbourne where there's it's pooch central. Like there are so many puppy dogs walking around. And as somebody who doesn't have a dog, I really appreciate that because it means I get great neighborhood pats and all that sort of stuff. But the amount of cruelty that I see people exhibiting in public to their companion pet, it just sits there as a very clear signal to me of just how big the wider problems of cruelty and how much cruelty is being ignored and accepted as totally normal. For me, every time I see somebody yank at their dog when they're, you know, when this, you know, this person who is walking around with this amazing sense of smell wants to sniff at something, like why on earth should that be a response, an adequate response? And why is it that I feel very deeply that if I was to walk up to that person and say, you know, really, if somebody yanked your neck while you're trying to look at something that interests you, how would you feel? You know, I feel very deeply that I would seem like the irrational person in that situation, and that really troubles me. So I think having people recognize cruelty when they are enacting it would be one thing that I would ask or want people to be able to do. And I think that could lead to greater change, maybe.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, Hayley. So what are you working on next?
I am working on converting my PhD into a book.
Wonderful.
Which is very exciting. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it.
Oh, good.
Yeah, the experience of writing a PhD does not feel like being a human trying to communicate to other humans.
Right.
It feels like being an academic thing, trying to communicate with other academic things.
Yeah.
So writing it in a human voice and just really being creative with it is great.
Oh, wonderful. So how can people find out more about your work?
Some of my work is up on academia.edu. I'm also now publishing a series of columns in a journal that's local to Melbourne called The Lifted Brow. And the journal, the column that I've been asked to write is about ecologies, but I'm focusing on meat ecologies, ecologies of meat. So in particular, the cultural ecologies of meat. So that would be another journal or place that people could find out about my work.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Hayley.
Thank you.
And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast, where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or we also have a Facebook page, which is called Knowing Animals. Don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Some people don't leave a review. How do I know that? Because I can see how many people have listened to the podcast, and I can also see how many reviews there are. I can tell you the numbers do not match up. Please leave a review. iTunes is all powerful. The ghost of Steve Jobs is watching you. Make sure you leave a review because that's how Knowing Animals goes to the top of the list of podcasts about animals, and that's how more people can find out about the podcast and also learn about knowing animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.